It's great to be here. There's been many highlights of this conference, and so to the Golden Gate team who put it together, a really remarkable event. It's been fun to read what Twitter is saying about the conference. I'm especially pleased myself, though, to be called out last night by Rune, the great anonymous Rune, who was complaining about the people wearing suits here, that we've despoiled the atmosphere. Although I did point out only Jaime Sevilla, who's here from Spain and runs Epoch AI, and I are really the only people wearing suits. But to actually be subtweeted by him is something I'll take away from this and carry with me. So, Rune, if you're in the room, thank you for doing that. I thought we'd talk about, start kind of like with three observations, talk about five legislative activities in DC, and close with two admonitions. And in so doing, I'm not going to really carry the flag for Americans for responsible innovation. We do have a particular view on most of these questions, right? We, as is well known, advocate for reasonable guardrails around AI. Not everyone here shares that same view, although many of you might. I'll try to speak more dispassionately about how I see DC's what's going on in DC and the kind of bills that you may care about. And hopefully we can argue about a few things as well. The first observation is not many people understand artificial intelligence, and you shouldn't really expect them to. I remember when we started ARI about a year and a half ago, we were on the Hill a lot. I was talking to members, former colleagues of mine, some of them close friends, who I was elected to the US House 25 years ago. And people like Adam Schiff was a close friend. We were elected together, and he's climbed the greasy pole and have a great chance to talk to people like that today. And most of them, even if you're from California or Virginia or maybe Washington State, where technology forms an important part of your constituency, you're really not that well informed on artificial intelligence. Indeed, a year and a half ago, if you were to use a word like AGI, much less ASI, people probably would know what you're talking about. And if they did, they would think it was so fantastical, you would probably lose all credibility in the room. That's changed very rapidly. Just over the last year, people use these terms frequently. Peter Wildeford from IAPS has been chronicling the number of people in Congress who will talk about AGI, ASI, reference it in some kind of speech or other written document. And he's now up to about 3 dozen members. And we recently did an event at ARI with senators and congressmen, and people freely of both parties talked about AGI, ASI. They would talk about alignment risk, ideas that were really far outside the Overton window not very long ago, are getting a bit of a purchase. Not widespread, but it will probably never be a widespread concern until you have some kind of preference cascade where every member of Congress is deeply engaged with it. I think the second issue is there is growing concern about how artificial intelligence is going. The one thing I always take away from my trips to the Bay Area is I do think people very much underestimate the blowback that is waiting to happen to artificial intelligence. Those of you who were in this room a couple of hours ago and heard the MAGA speaker caught a bit of that kind of vibe, but there's a lot of opposition. In fact, all of the polling, Democratic and Republican alike, says anywhere from 80 to 95% of the people want regulation around AI. Now, you may think that's ill-conceived, but it is important to recognize that there's a lot of potential energy out there that when some kind of catalyzing event occurs is going to lead to some radical political action, perhaps even an overreaction from ARI's perspective on this. But there is growing concern, and growing concern too about something that in the AI safety community, where I spend most of my time, I don't think is spoken of enough, and that is the economics of artificial intelligence. Right now, we are in, I think it is fair to say, a world where 4 or 5 people could crash the global economy. Right, the data center build out that's going to be, $500 billion this year alone. If someone were to say like, "Hey, I've rethought that, but we're just going to like abandon those plans in some way," it would send the U.S. economy, the global economy, far south. I mean, that level of power, where one stock, Nvidia, is basically carrying the entire stock market, does have the attention of people in Washington D.C. And they're often flummoxed, as am I, about what seems to be kind of a circular economy here, right? Where each day's Wall Street Journal report is that OpenAI is buying, 300 billion from Oracle, and Nvidia is doing 100 billion into OpenAI, and we're going to be building 250 gigawatts of energy. And each of those gigawatts, by the way, the scholars are now saying costs anywhere from 30 to $50 billion a pop. So 250 gigawatts, if some congressman does the math, is $12.5 trillion, which is half the US economy. And if done in a single year, would be the third largest economy in the world. People are like, you know, I don't know how this all adds up. And I'm like a bit worried that if the so-called bubble, of which there are more and more people talking about those kind of things, if it does puncture, sure, it may be great things come after it, as we've seen in past bubbles that popped. But what the near-term effects could be are ones that I think many members of Congress very much resonate to. And they also resonate to the stories of children being led to self-harm through artificial intelligence. These are the kind of things that get members of Congress fired up, even if they don't understand the technology themselves or don't closely follow it a lot either. There are a lot of odd, as a third observation, a lot of odd coalitions developing. That MAGA story earlier, where people were asked about the moratorium, speaks to that. So we at ARI were very involved in organizing the coalition to try to defeat the state moratorium that was coming through the U.S. Senate. And the truth is, most Democrats were easy to persuade, for better or worse, right? Democrats are generally for regulation. They kind of prima facie will support regulation of industry. They think that's an appropriate thing to do. Republicans, of course, don't share that kind of common belief. And so getting them to support regulation is often a more challenging item. But in that end, right, it was, as our speaker said, the MAGA base that came through. Right, there was a group of senators who strongly believed in kind of the populist wing of the Republican Party today. Marsha Blackburn, people like Josh Hawley, who I'll mention again in a moment, are really leaders in that. And they find common cause with the most liberal Democratic members of the House and Senate to push various AI proposals forward. And you can see in the future that that's going to be a very powerful coalition that's kind of aligned against maybe neoliberal Democrats and Republicans, right, who are more of your typical Main Street business-friendly Republicans. So the populist base and the left are finding common cause in a lot of these issues, and the moratorium is a great example of that. So a couple of things coming through. Josh Hawley, who I mentioned a moment ago, is a brilliant man, right? Educated here in not far from us in Stanford, Yale Law School, clerks for the U.S. Supreme Court, a true MAGA believer. And he's probably emerged as the biggest critic of social media and the tech industry in all of Congress. No Democrat can really hold a candle to the level of vitriol he brings to these causes. And AI is just one part of his portfolio on this. But he's introduced a number of bills. Indeed, this week, one that I think will probably be remembered for a very long time. And it's called the AI Risk Evaluation Act. He introduced it with Richard Blumenthal, a liberal Democrat from Connecticut. And what it does is it introduces terms that have heretofore, at least to my knowledge, never been in any legislation. The word artificial superintelligence is defined in it. He talks about incidents that have to be reported to what he envisions as a new part of the Department of Energy. And some of those incidents would involve scheming risk, misalignment, the kind of things that, well, people in this room work on, they know these terms well, but in Washington, D.C., you don't hear those terms a lot. And so he envisions a very strict regulatory scheme from the Department of Energy that would look at these kind of questions. That's an innovation. It's unlikely to pass. I think that is for sure. But these things take a while to gestate. And just introducing the idea into the bloodstream of something like ASI, well, that is a novelty to Washington, D.C. He's also introducing bills with another liberal Democrat, Dick Durbin, to get at a more practical problem that exists today. There's been a couple of speakers here. We're lucky at the conference to have some really amazing AI lawyers, right? This is a burgeoning industry that we work a lot with, Law AI, Claire, the network of law professors around the country. We have our Yale law professor who's here, others, right, who are really thinking through some complicated questions because AI is introducing some first order legal questions that will require some innovation in the law as well. And one of those is in product liability. Is artificial intelligence a product subject to product liability law, or is it a service? Right? Software, that question has bedeviled courts over the last 30 years about what software is, and they've made some courts make distinctions between ready to use off the shelf software as opposed to bespoke software. But in any event, Hawley and Dick Durbin have introduced a bill to clearly define large language models, generative AI more broadly, as a product and subject to product liability law, which is interesting. And maybe this is good in some perverse way. If you're working at a lab today, it would create a federal cause of action. So usually these product liability suits, right, are at the state level, 50 states, all of which have slightly different rules. Some follow the second restatement, some the third, right? Some have some kind of hybrid approach. So it's a very complicated area of law that differs by jurisdiction. But he would create a federal cause of action for product liability for AI, defining it clearly as a product. So that's another kind of interesting thing that's happening out there. The next bill I'll mention quickly is the moratorium fight, which in no way has disappeared. Right? This remains, I think, in the short term, the ambition of many people who want to see, well, two things they want to see. One, I think, and these are both good faith arguments, by the way, even though I disagree with them both, to be honest. One is they don't want to see 50 state patchwork of laws, right? They find that cumbersome, inhibiting commerce in some way. Having a federal standard that preempts all of that patchwork of laws seems like it would aid commerce in a very world-changing industry for us. And the second reason is, I think, that I'm more skeptical of is the proposals that would come along with it. I mean, most people in general think like, well, one can make an intellectual case for preemption in the face of a comprehensive federal regulatory scheme. But that's where the action is. Like, what is a comprehensive regulatory scheme? You're soon going to see coming from the House of Representatives, led by two Californians, probably. Most importantly, Jay Obernolte, who, if you follow California politics, he's from Big Bear. He's a graduate of Caltech, made a fortune in the video game industry. He understands the technology very well, and he has an outsized influence in the Republican conference. They look to him to kind of understand it and give them guidance about it. And I think he's going to introduce a bill that rumor says will add more than the last moratorium did. The last moratorium was kind of just a naked kind of moratorium, like no state law, nothing in exchange for it. This will do something like put the Center for AI Standards Innovation into statute, not immediately be a part of executive orders. It may promote whistleblowers, which is another bill worth talking about. There's a freestanding whistleblower bill out there that Chuck Grassley in the Senate has championed. We've been active on that too. But it does something also new, which is, for the first time in whistleblower law, it's not simply reporting violations of the law. It's reporting violations that could be unsafe. Right? So legal activity that people have concerns about will be covered by the whistleblower statute. That too could be in what the Republican House is likely to deliver on a moratorium. And finally, coming really from Senator Cruz, who's working on this issue too, a so-called regulatory sandbox. He, in fact, has a bill out there with a regulatory sandbox. And that term doesn't just announce what it means. I myself sometimes like scratch my head what they mean by that. But essentially, it would allow any AI company to seek an exemption from federal rules if it was approved by the agency or the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House for 2 years, where they could experiment with how their LLMs go. So basically, an exemption from federal rules if you're granted that waiver, and it can be extended for another 8. So you can basically have a 10-year exemption from federal regulation if you had the right people approve it along the way. So those are some big bills coming through. And then there's like some other things that, right, they don't get your blood racing, but they're the kind of things that I think actually could be really important. One is, and this has bipartisan support, it could well be added on to one of the moratorium bills as well, because it has bipartisan support, the so-called CREATE Act, which is an attempt to spend over 5 years, a few $1 billion to get compute in the hand of researchers and public entities. Basically, it would build out the AI capabilities of the national laboratories and allow professors to access that mostly, right, and other research entities. Because I think people do perceive rightly that the universities are suffering in the new paradigm. Only 40% of machine learning PhDs go into academia, less than 1% go into government. And there's good reasons for that. Not only the salaries, which are 3 orders of magnitude better sometimes, but better data sets, more access to compute, right? If you're interested in those kind of things, industry offers them to you. But universities should have more access to this kind of public compute. So ideas like that are floating around too, that I think will have a lot of bipartisan support and strike me as like an unalloyed good. Let me maybe conclude, then we can answer questions about things about a couple of admonitions. And these may get more into kind of my own views of things, if you don't mind. First of all, don't no matter which side of these debates you're on, and we have people, I think, in the room here. I see Neil from Abundance and others who we spar with on occasion, work with, hopefully more in the future too. We don't always agree on these kind of questions, and that is as it should be, by the way, because they often go to first order values and how you think the economy should be organized and how the government should be run. But we should never overestimate the other side either. A lot of times when I read things, especially social media, and they're like, this AI safety community, it's a doomsday cult, or it's like organized. I mean, they have like these ideas of conspiracy and cohesion that I myself never see. And I'm quite active in it. I myself never witnessed the level of coordination that many critics allege of it. And on the other side is the same situation. Certainly there are libertarian funders in this world, the Koch family or A16Z increasingly, right? But they're pushing ideas they want, and they're not omnipotent. And that might go to worth saying, like, on this question, to talk about something that has been on a lot of people's mind here, which is like money and politics, right? And the fear that a lot of money is coming in to influence elections. And the example of crypto regulation in the last election, right, being a salutary example of how influence is being had. And I think it is true to say that influence by the so-called fair shake super PAC, they spent over $100 million, has had influence in Congress, right? People now, if they don't even support it actively, they don't actively oppose it, right? Which is a win in and of itself. But one shouldn't like overestimate even that. And I'll tell you why. I was looking at this recently just because I was curious about it as people here were talking. Money in politics is very important. And for those of you who can give money to candidates, you should, right? Hard dollars are much more valuable than the soft dollar expenditures from super PACs. Super PACs can have an influence too. And they certainly have, as I said. But even when you look at like the fair shake example, I'll make this case to you. They spent $100 million. $40 million of it was against Sherrod Brown in Ohio, right? Who was chair of the Senate Banking Committee, a well-known critic of crypto. Now, I know Sherrod well. We served in Congress together. I love Sherrod. He's actually one of the very best members of Congress I've ever known. He was dead man walking 5.5 years ago, right? It didn't take the crypto 20 million to defeat Sherrod Brown. He's running in an increasingly conservative state of Ohio. He's a very, very liberal, one of the most liberal senators in the country. If David Shore, who's here, the great Democratic pollster, he would agree with me that Sherrod Brown, from my perspective, sad to say, he was defeated 5 years ago, right? That campaign was never going to be winnable for a Democrat. And yes, there was a lot of super PAC spending on it, but the super PAC spending didn't influence the outcome of the race in any way, right? But of course, the narrative is what really matters. And some of us should lean into that narrative because there's a narrative you can read if you Google it. Hey, these guys changed the outcome of the Ohio Senate race. They didn't do that. Right? The second biggest expenditure from a fair shake group was here in California against Katie Porter, right? Against Adam Schiff in the Democratic primary, the jungle primary, if you will, for governor. Now, Katie Porter, I don't know her. I think she was seen as maybe a critic of the industry. I don't know. Adam Schiff led every poll from the jump in that Senate campaign, right? From November 2023 till the end, he led every single poll. Adam Schiff is a formidable fundraiser. He was an MSNBC mainstay, right? Popular with the liberal base because of his opposition to President Trump. Adam Schiff was going to win that race too, right? I don't see like it was going to be Steve Garvey versus Adam Schiff in the end under all scenarios. And so you look at these kind of campaigns, right, of what people are doing, and you're like, they don't pick winners, they jump on winners, right? And then spend a narrative of influence on the back end, which is not to say they can't have some influence, like a great congresswoman, one of my favorite congresswomen, a new member of Congress from Phoenix, Arizona. She won her primary by 64 votes. Fair Shake spent $1.5 million in support of her. Can they say they influenced the outcome? Yeah, I would say they probably could, because every single person who gave $1 to her, right, could claim that they were a but-for cause of her success in some way. So I think we shouldn't overestimate in any way, like, the power of the other side. In both these cases, people are actually arguing in D.C. for the right kind of thing in their mind. Money is important, but we shouldn't overestimate importance, which is the last thing I will say is the good guys do win in the end in Washington, D.C. Now, the mode of victory and the blood you have to, spend, that may be changed from fight to fight, but the good guys usually do in the end. And perhaps at the next panel, we can debate like which side is the good guys or not. But whichever you believe is that the right ideas do prevail over time there. So it's a very exciting time to be in DC. There's a proliferating number of groups on all sides of this. A lot of times we do find common cause. But other times, like I said, it's a great fight of what's a very important issue and a very fun one for me to be a part of as well. So with that, maybe I will open up to questions as well. And happy to argue with anyone if they would like to challenge me on the merits of anything ARI has done as well. So
Actually, to start things off, I have a question for you. Where do you see, kind of ending on this like positive note, where do you see the greatest opportunity to mobilize or capitalize on actually getting safeguards in place?
I think, my theory of change is heavily influenced by two experiences in my life. One is when I was an academic at the University of Virginia, I taught government innovation, which actually does have like a robust literature about how change happens in government and various competing theories that they empirically try to test or not. And the other one was my time in Congress on 9/11, because I served on that. I was there when that event happened. And what I saw there was something that I imagine happens on AI in the future. And it's worth like spending a couple minutes about what that 9/11 experience was like. So we should have known about Al Qaeda more, because Al Qaeda, after all, had bombed the embassies in East Africa. Bill Clinton, right, had famously hit the pharmaceutical factory in Sudan in response. They had bombed the USS Cole, Al Qaeda had. So if you were a follower of world events, Al Qaeda should have been known to you. Osama bin Laden was the most wanted man in the world. But when 9/11 happened, no one knew who Al Qaeda was. No one, right? A few hours after it happened, people kind of began to leak out for the intelligence community. They thought that this group, Al Qaeda, had done it. Nobody knew who they were, honestly. No one. And I can remember this like frantic effort to try to get smarter about it. Bernard Lewis, the academic at Princeton, momentarily became famous, right? Because he had written these books on the history of Islam and the development of the Muslim world. Everybody was reading Jane's Defense Weekly, trying to like catch up on who the latest terror group was. But even after all of that, right, we were involved in 20 years of war, more or less. People still didn't really understand these groups. There's like the famous episodes where Jon Stewart has a bit about this, if you ever want to find it on YouTube, right? Where they asked like the head of the FBI counterterrorism group, this is like 2004, so we're 3 years into the war on terror. They asked him, like, do you know the difference in Sunni and Shia? Nope, he didn't. He said, which one's Al Qaeda, Sunni or Shia? He didn't, right? And this is like true of like the people who are running the government. These are like people who are head of counterterror policy. This is the way the world works in DC. People are generalists, they're smart, they're good administrators, they're deeply committed, they know certain things in depth, a lot of things in width. But AI is going to be that kind of way too. But what I saw on 9/11 was, on 9/13, we voted on things that were so outrageous on 9/10, right? But nobody paid the lick of attention. But it's like it immediately went through 100%. Because what had happened? People who are interested in digital surveillance, in how this new era allowed for intelligence fusion across many modalities. These kind of things in the 1990s were outrageous, civil liberty violations. Admiral Poindexter proposed some of these ideas back in the first George Bush administration, and he got fired for doing it. Total information awareness. It was like, everyone opposed these kind of ideas. On 9/13, they all passed because in the interim, a lot of people in think tanks, in universities, independent researchers thought a lot about it. They socialized it. They created networks among themselves, right? They vetted ideas and thought them all through to make sure they were smart and not half-baked. They baked them fully. And then when people were looking for things to do, right, it was a moment to grab those things off the shelf and pass the Patriot Act and many things like that, right? They didn't invent the Patriot Act on 9/12. It had been sitting around for years in various forms, various parts. They put it together. So how does AI happen? Something similar, I can imagine, to that, right? Our job in many ways, if you're a group like ARI or Abundance or the other groups here, is to develop those ideas with the expectation that the next month will be stasis and nothing will happen until something happens, and overnight, like, the world shifts, and we have the policies, the ideas, the expertise in place, the networks preset, that you use them. I mean, that is what policy entrepreneurship is about. So I see AI going that way. And well, I think probably all of us, that's probably all the groups here, is whatever your perspective on these things, probably is in an articulate or unarticulated way trying to contribute to that.
Can you say a bit more about this new? You mentioned J.O. Anulti's idea of a moratorium. Could you maybe say a little bit more about what you think that would look like and what you think a sensible form of moratorium or preemption would be?
So J.O. Bernalty, the congressman from Big Bear I mentioned, who's influential in the Republican conference, the rumor is it will look something along the lines of a moratorium of state laws, generally, with in exchange for that, to try to entice some Democrats to support it, which is necessary for Senate passage. Things like putting Casey into statute, the whistleblower bill that Chuck Grassley has pushed, maybe some more funding for certain entities out there. Um, Basically, those kind of ideas that are out there. So I think our view of it is this. I think a modest pushback to a meme I hear a lot, and I've heard a lot even here. It's like, well, with AI, we should regulate outputs, not inputs, right? And this should guide our regulatory view. And I always want to say, why? I mean, that rhymes and it sounds like so glib that you're almost like persuaded by it per se. But like, why would I, if I think about it twice, like, why would I go for that? Because it seems to me like the theory of regulation tells us that there are appropriate levels to regulate various risks. So when there are risks that are extraordinary and global, you usually regulate it at like the product level. When it's about your implementation, you regulate it at the use level. I mean, one thinks of vehicles. We have preemptive rules on product design in vehicles because we don't want Ford to have 50 different, cars, F-150s on the road. And they're preemptive and they're mandated by the federal government, and every state has to abide by them. But states, right, have a lot of rules about implementation, who can drive the cars, the rules about it, fuel standards, these kind of things. So the question about AI is, what are the risks? And then finding the appropriate level to regulate it. So if you ask me what the risks from AI are that most people seem to agree about, there are probably many of them at the input level, right? Because they are high risk and they're global in nature. And so regulating it at the product level makes a lot of sense. The input level makes a lot of sense. So I think that's one of the big disputes. One of the things that there was a task force last year, a bipartisan task force that Ted Lieu from California chaired with J.O. Bernalty. And this was one of their major conclusions, is that we should just regulate AI by its end use. And I don't think enough thought was put into that, but it will be along those lines as well, to say, like, you let it be regulated only by its end use. I think from my own perspective, the theoretical justification for that, as well as the practical effect of that, are ones that should be resisted. One should be thoughtful about various levels of regulation on this. So I think that's what he's probably going to push. It'll be interesting in the Senate, where the real action is, right? The votes in the House are there today to get these kind of things through. In the Senate, I think it'll be harder go. People want more than that. I think, one can imagine some kind of trade-off here, but it's going to have to be something that we think advances, AI security and safety over the long haul. Because I think the scare, I think the danger it is, I think like, and Alexandra and I talked about this yesterday, about like Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which everyone hates this in Washington, D.C., every single person. The problem is it's like a Condorcet winner. Everyone prefers it to the alternative. And so the right hates it for their reasons, the left hates it for their reasons, and so we live with it. But everyone despises it. So you don't get that many chances to do the right thing, and that's why one should push to like get the right thing there. It has a lot of inertia once there. And you don't want it to be another Section 230 where we have to live with it 40 years after and everyone laments the fact, but you can't find a solution that people agree to. I should mention one other thing that I did pass over in kind of the observations that related to this is like the whole question of China is a very important one. In DC, I think both parties, again, for better or worse, depending on your perspective, have bought into the China race narrative. Um, and to the extent people care about AI, I would bet 90% of them view it through that lens. It's like, is this a weapon? Can it be weaponized? Is China going to beat us to something? And this is a very powerful idea that has, like I said, taken root. And one can contest it, and I myself would like to contest it more, but it is just the force that dominates a lot of what's happening in Washington, D.C. Is like, how's China doing? What's it? Which is like, for people in this room who are in the university community, or even the think tank space, a massively unmet need is like, what's China really think about AI, right? We have this vision that, hey, they're like, you know, going, crazy, and they're like, don't care about safety or regulation. And it is true. You see like people, interview like some Tsinghua grad student who's like, safety, what is that? Right? They care about safety maybe about like in different ways, regime stability, these kind of matters. But I think there's a lot of evidence that China cares quite deeply about regulating AI and are not some kind of like, you know, pull the ripcord and let everybody race and hopefully get there first. But this is the view of DC, and it's a fear of DC. It's actually understanding what's being written in various Mandarin publications and what the military is saying about it. Is an incredible value add because it said this meme that China is outracing us, I think is actually probably not true, right? That they have like a more complicated view of things. Um, but that is work we have to do in DC to persuade people of what China's real intent is. So just like actually, maybe China, that is their intent. Understanding China better is like a very important thing, I think, for everybody, AI and beyond, right? We don't understand our adversary. And if you look at the history of like the Cold War, which is revelatory, I think, to like how we're approaching this new Cold War, if you will, right? The misunderstanding of the Soviets proved to be enormously expensive and quite dangerous to us, that we didn't really, as the archives now reveal, understand their motivations. We should try to do better here. And AI is just one part of that. But China and AI in DC are inextricably linked. And so if you don't like that, you need to fight back on that because it's a hard thing. But it is the lens through which they all interpret matters.
I was wondering, thank you so much for that going through those different bills and sharing your expertise. I was wondering if you could talk about the Gain AI bill and what's your kind of thoughts on that, and then also just if you have any thoughts on the different kind of state bills and what the process you see for like if there is going to be a patchwork and then it gets really annoying and then you have to do something federal. What kind of what kind of process do you kind of could you imagine happening there?
So the GAIN Act is introduced by Senator Jim Banks from Indiana, a very strong conservative, been part of the Freedom Caucus in the House for many years before moving over to the U.S. Senate. So a very conservative member of the House. What he is working on is something that we spent a lot of time on too, that I did quickly pass over, which is export controls. And this question of, to the China contest, how we should think about Chinese AI and export of Chinese chips to China. So it's a concern for a lot of people, including many of the China hawks in the Republican Party, that there's a lot of waffling from the administration on the export controls, right? President Trump has dinner with Jensen and, H-20s are on the market or, so there's a lot of concern about this kind of thing. And so people are trying to get after it. The export controls are all regulatory, not in statute. And so how do you enforce it? So what Senator Banks proposed to do, and he got this into the National Defense Authorization Act, which is one of the must-pass bills in the U.S. Congress. Things don't move very quickly. That's one of the ones that does move every single year. So people like to add a lot of things to it. Was this like pretty clever, slightly gimmicky, but thing we supported of saying, you know what? American companies have to have all of their chip demand met before one can export these chips to China, basically, right? So it's a way of like getting at export controls through the back door, if you will. Right. And because American companies have an insatiable demand, presumably there'll be none left over, right, for China to have. So that's what he wanted to do. It got into the Senate Manager's Amendment. I think the view is it's probably not going to survive the whole process of it, but it does reveal this schism which does exist. And you know, the president has a lot of authority over his Republican base, but the China question will divide them. Because some of these folks are very, very hawkish on the China matter, and the export controls has gotten people like Banks, Representative Molinar in the House, quite fired up about what they're doing. So that's what the GAIN Act is trying to do, and it shows this broader battle over export controls that the House and the Senate are trying to deal with within the constraints of an administration that many of them, right, are quite close to as well. So that's what they're trying to do.
I'll stand so you can see me. I'm curious how you're thinking about Europe as a lever. We heard on one stage yesterday that Europe is the greatest adversary that the U.S. faces. Obviously, there is a dominant cultural narrative in some factions right now. But on the other hand, the Codes of Practice is one of the only games in town to have meaningful disclosures from the participating companies around how they're thinking of some of the risks that ARI is being focused on. So I'm curious how you're navigating that and thinking of that strategy right now.
Gingerly, because people like Dean control every lever of power, right? You saw what his view of the EU was for in that session yesterday that I moderated, right? When he wasn't just pessimistic about the EU, right? His view was, you're an enemy to the country, more or less. So I think the answer is the code of practice is very interesting, right? Most of the companies have signed on to it. Meta, an exception, X, right? One of the three parts of the code of practice, but the other, OpenAI and Google and Anthropic, all signed on to the three major parts of that. It's a stricter regulatory scheme than anything has been proposed in the US, right? In terms of what disclosures would be required, stricter than what's happened here in California, stricter than the RAISE Act that's pending in New York on Kathy Hochul's desk. So one of the questions I asked several people, right, who work at the labs here is like, you've already signed on to the European Code of Practice, why don't we just like do the same thing here? Well, the answer is like that makes a lot of sense in some ways, except for the fact that um, the EU example is one that's toxic in DC today, right? I mean, if you just mention to any person in any party, they don't even understand the details. The EU AI Act is a byword for like regulatory excess. And you just say it and be like, oh, is this like, are you doing what the EU is doing? And that's like actually a common criticism of people, who might be interested in some kind of regulatory framework. Like, this sounds like the EU. It's like, and the whole scheme from, GDPR to digital markets to digital services, Congress seems to loathe it for, again, better or worse. So I think that actually hurts its traction in some ways. But you may have seen, I think it was publicly released, where Chris Lahane wrote on behalf of OpenAI in the run up to SB 53 that he said, hey, we've signed on to the code of practice. How about we call that a day and make it like compliant, make that good. Yeah, my response would be like, he didn't promise to comply with the code of practice, right? But if people were to comply with the code of practice here in the U.S., I think a lot of people would be quite pleased by that. So it's an opening, right? It's an opening, and there are people here at the conference I know from the EU I've talked to who want to see that, and I think it's a possibility. Is all I could say. But the EU brand is a very difficult one, and that makes it hard to even have like a reasonable conversation. In the same way, I mean, it goes to the like I'll make a assertion about how a lot of these things work in DC. There's like a hyperstition aspect to it. The China arms race is this way too, right? That it's closed off a lot of debate. Where if you want to say like, I don't think we're racing with China. I think the arms race metaphor isn't really working for us. It's actually counterproductive. You're excluded from the conversation in lots of ways. Adopting EU approaches gets you similarly excluded to that, right? It creates its own reality in some way. So that's, I think, the challenge to it. But the code of practice is something that when I talk to the lab leaders, you could see how since they've signed on to it, it could build to something next.
Hi, really excellent. It's been nice to see you talking across a bunch of different sessions. So there's a piece of this story around adoption of AI that I haven't heard talked about very much, and that's consumer protections, whether it's the end user or actually now there's a whole market for AI systems, right? Companies are buying them, small businesses are buying them. And it's not clear to me if there's really much going on in terms of protections, laws, regulation, anything around protecting small businesses or other businesses that are now buying them, and just kind of how that's a bigger part of this story.
It plays into it this way. I think there is actually a lot of activity at the states on those kind of questions, right? And um, controversially, not always successfully, because these are hard questions. And state legislators have no resources. If you've been around state politicians, they're like them and their assistant, and they don't have a lot of ability to convene expert panels. And so I think there's a lot of work on those kind of things happening at the state level that in some ways drives the effort for a moratorium because people are concerned about how those will all go in that score. So I think there is actually a lot of work, and it plays into this larger question. It's especially Colorado's seemingly botched efforts to get after all these kinds of things. So I think there is actually a lot of work being thought of in that respect. Does that answer your partially?
Is it leaning towards, I guess, protecting small businesses? Because of course, right now there's kind of an adopt at all costs. There's a lot of pressure from stakeholders uh, to bring AI systems in to innovate across the workforce or across whatever workflows they have. But there might also be pressure from like those who are consuming their products that they don't especially want this. I just there's this other kind of burgeoning part of the market that's going on with AI, and I'm just wondering kind of what's going on in this area with respect to either whether it's protections or whether there's more information or something else, or what you think should be done.
They don't have good answers for what should be done. I think there is a lot. I mean, I think in the sense of like not protecting maybe small businesses from AI, but protecting workers from the use by businesses of AI. I mean, you see that here in California. There's the No Robot Bosses Act, which is sitting on Gavin Newsom's desk. Right, you're going to see more of those kind of things. There's a lot of action in the states about these algorithms and hiring, firing decisions. Right, lots of questions about. Um, those kind of bias issues. So I think there's a lot of those kind of things. So not protecting small businesses as a consumer, but protecting the employees of people, I think. And you're going to see more and more action of that, right? And a lot of this work is happening in very red states. Texas has been very active as an example, because you have this like Bannon-esque kind of thing, right? Where people are definitely worried about the cultural aspects of AI, and right, they rebel against that in some ways that you heard from some of the earlier speakers at the conference. So I think there's work on that space.
Hey, great talk. It was super interesting to hear you talk about DC. I'm curious if you think the conversation will change if Democrats take the House in 26, and if so, how?
Well, I think it will put a lot of things on ice a bit because Democrats presumably defeat the moratorium, full stop, and that kind of comes to an end, right? And things get jammed up a little bit, but it doesn't loosen things up for activity, right? I mean, right now you have a lot of entrenched interests, a lot of money floating around that it's hard to make forward progress. The moratorium fight's about playing defense if you're on our side of this question, and you can still do that. But, and a few things get taken off the table, but I don't think Democrats taking the House advances the cause much. There has to be more education. It's going to have to be a partly Republican effort because you can't succeed in the U.S. Senate, right, without bipartisan effort in the same way that Republicans are trying to get Democrats to sign on to some of these things. So you have to find some kind of common cause. There is a common cause there. Like I said, the Holly Wing, the Marsha Blackburn, the Jerry Moran. If people had the moratorium fight shows us a bit. There's a lot of pressure coming from a lot of people. But there were a core of 6 or 7 Republican senators who they wouldn't necessarily raise their hands, but they were against it and strongly against it, and urging John Thune to like spike it from the jump. Didn't get there, right? But they were there. They weren't like going to go out on the hustings and make a big deal out of it. Marsha Blackburn, right, is unique in that respect. She's running for governor of Tennessee. The creators are a massive constituency for her. So she's right. She's like representing Silicon Valley, kind of, if you will. I mean, this is like so important to her people there in that respect. But the others were like, this is super dangerous to even be on this side. So there's a constituency out there, I think, for like reasonable pro-innovation. That's the key, right? It's not pause AI. I think people want to say like, we'd like more transparency. We'd like to see how this is working. We'd like interim progress reports on what it's doing to the economy. These kind of things. I think there's a constituency there. Most Democrats, again, just because they're predisposed to like putting requirements on business and throwing sand into the gears of the market for better or worse, again. And this group of Republicans, the MAGA strong populist base, Marjorie Taylor Greene of the House, one of the most outspoken anti-moratorium people. So, yeah, I think there's a world where you can see things changing over the next few years. I think one chamber changing probably has less impact than you might think, right? It's about a global educational effort to convince people of what's happening out there in Congress and convincing congressmen of both parties to support something like that.
In your opening comments, you reflected about the large amounts of money that have been invested, and then you went on to talk a lot about some of the social effects. Just in your last references to Marjorie Blackburn, obviously she represents creatives. She also represents or would represent as governor, or Memphis, where there are some really large clusters. Could you talk about sort of that dynamic between the amount of money that has been invested into these systems and how that might change alliances with finance in this on one side and maybe social issues on the other in Congress?
Yeah, she has a tough job. That's a tough spot to be in. I think it's important upon us to make the issue salient to voters. Because if it's just a money question, right, then things become very difficult. There's usually more money on the other side of my bet that I'm making, right? Is we have money on our side, but not what they have on their side if they want to do it. So I think what's incumbent upon it, if you care about the issues I do and take my perspective on them, is voters have to care. And then voters do matter, right? Most of the things you do in Congress, you can get by without voters caring, right? They're like obscure. I mean, I give my great example to people to show how Congress really works. So I was a congressman. I had my biggest donor come to me, my biggest donor. He said, I only care about one thing. I was like, on tenterhooks. Like, what could this be? He's going to ask me to betray some core principle of mine or do something. And he said, I want snowmobiles in Yellowstone Park. That's all I care about. And I'm like, I don't have a strong view on the snowmobile in Yellowstone Park. And I could probably work with you on that question, right? Because no voter cared about it. And, it was like a very strange thing. But on issues that people do care about, abortion, guns, right, education, social welfare, social security, those things, the voters carry a lot of weight. And so I think the question is like, if we're in a world where like, hey, I got, Andreessen over here who's coming in big and, that's like super dangerous. I mean, yeah, that's like not a good place to be. The question is you have to make it salient to the voters. I think the issue will become salient to the voters as they see AI become more pervasive in the economy and they see both its good and bad parts of it. But that's the key. So Marshall Butler's got a tough thing. Elon Musk is sitting there, right, with 200,000 GPUs in Memphis, and right, you got the creators. So that's a hard thing. She's probably with the creators because that's probably the smarter political play, I would think, if I'm her advisor. But that's not a spot for AI. If you care about AI policy, you don't want her to be in that spot, right, where she's just weighing like who's going to spend the most money to defeat me and who can give the biggest fundraiser. So I don't know, I think, is the answer to that. We're in a dangerous place if it's just about money, because the other side will have a lot. This other side of my bet always has more money on things. And so you have to make something that people will vote on, that voters care about. Because in the end, that is what matters, right? Voters do matter. If you can find an issue that's important to them, and one of the tasks for people like me is to make it more important to them. So we should go to Neil, then we'll come up here as our last two. Is that good? Can we do one more? Couple more? Then we'll do it. Let's go to Neil right here.
Thanks. So I've had some amazing conversations this weekend with people that I don't agree with, or I didn't know how much I agreed with. And so I want to take an opportunity here to maybe find some common ground between ARI and abundance on preemption. This gentleman asked this sort of question about like what you would support in preemption. And so you referenced the vehicle standards, right, which is a federal preemptive framework. So in principle, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but just you can answer this. Like in principle, there is a federal framework for which ARI would support preemption of state law on some scope. Yes or no?
Somewhere in the multiverse that exists, and it involves in some way mandatory evaluations of some kind. And I've not seen any proposal come from folks, again, in the good faith discussions we have, that talk about that. I mean, I think there has to be a mandatory evaluation regime at the federal level, minimally, if you're going to preempt all state laws on it.
Okay, that's super helpful.
Yeah.
So I wondered if you could give us any sort of insight in the psychology of the administration, where on the one hand, it's very gung-ho about promoting American AI and American AI primacy in the world. And on the other hand, it seems very hostile to funding scientific research, allowing skilled talent to come into the country, are clearly very antagonistic to universities. These seem in opposition. I think I understand the political reasons, but I'm not sure I do. Could you just give us an insight into their psychology?
No, I mean, there are people who could do that better who are part of the movement. All political movements, though, are completely incoherent. That's the nature of them, right? This isn't philosophy where we're going for first principles. It's about coalitions and about trying to get people together, in some way. And they found a great coalition, probably united by a certain cultural theme, right? Of, anger about the way the world is, about the inefficacy of government, COVID hangover, right, and the restrictions on that. I mean, I think there's you can find a kind of common psychological theme through the base, but right, the issue by issue, it's the MAGA base, Steve Bannon and David Sachs don't really agree on many things, but that's politics. Because I promise you, when I was in office, I disagreed with many things. It's like it's a coalition of coalitional work, and one shouldn't expect principled behavior on an incident level is a good thing, but as a party, you're kind of an unprincipled agglomeration of interests, and that's not a bad thing either. So I think it's how you explain it. It's very potent. I mean, very clever. What President Trump has done in amassing this coalition is one for the ages, to be closely studied. Right? It's been a remarkable effort to transform a whole political party, to mobilize previously unmobilized people, to give people voice who didn't. I mean, whatever you think of him, there's a lot to study there, whether you're on the left or right, about the success of that. So, all
Awesome.
right. Thank you, guys.